I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
It was not a speech. It was not a ceremony. It was a message that left a future king unable to stand. The update. The update was delivered without ceremony. There was no podium, no broadcast address, no national anthem to soften the blow. Instead, shortly after dawn, King Charles III authorized a tightly worded communication that moved swiftly through official channels before the public even realized something was wrong. Inside Buckingham Palace, the language was described as clinical, measured, almost detached. But the effect was anything but. When Prince William received the update, it was not as a press release or briefing note. It was delivered privately, with advisors present but silent, its significance immediately understood by everyone in the room. This was not information meant to reassure. It was information meant to prepare. The wording acknowledged a serious development, not unexpected but unavoidable now, the kind of update that shifts conversations from contingency to consequence. For William, the moment landed with a weight he had spent years trying to outrun. He had lived this before, not these words, not this father, but this sensation, the sudden collapse of distance between future and present, between theory and responsibility. The realization that something long discussed in abstract terms had moved decisively into reality. Those closest to him later described the reaction not as dramatic, but as raw. There was silence first, then disbelief, brief, instinctive, quickly abandoned, and finally, emotion that could not be contained by protocol. The tears were not performative. They were not witnessed by cameras or recorded by staff. They came in the private space between father and son, where monarchy offers no protection at all. Charles, for his part, did not soften the message. He could not. As king, he understood the necessity of clarity. As a father, he understood the cost of delivering it. The update was framed as factual, but its implications were unmistakable. The timeline had changed. What had once been hypothetical was now active. The palace did not elaborate publicly. It would not. The update was never intended to explain, only to signal that a boundary had been crossed. Within minutes, internal protocols shifted. Schedules were reviewed. Communications tightened. The machinery of the institution adjusted with practiced efficiency. But none of that mattered in the room where William stood, listening to a truth he had hoped would remain distant longer than this. This was not about succession, not yet. It was about loss anticipated, measured, and now impossible to ignore. And as the palace moved swiftly to contain the impact, one fact became clear to those who understood the language of monarchy better than most. This update was not the end of a chapter. It was the opening of one that would change everything that followed. Before the words were spoken, the update did not arrive suddenly, even if it felt that way to the world beyond the palace gates. In truth, it had been forming for days, quietly, methodically, with the kind of caution reserved for moments when language itself becomes dangerous. In the final week before the confirmation, Buckingham Palace entered a familiar but unwelcome rhythm. Meetings multiplied. Briefings grew more frequent. Corridors once used for routine movement became places of pause, where staff waited, listened, and adjusted their expressions before stepping into rooms where decisions carried irreversible weight. At the center of it all were the medical briefings. They were never described as alarming, not officially, but they were precise, and precision in such contexts is rarely comforting. The language was careful, stripped of drama, focused on facts rather than forecasts. Progress was discussed. So were limitations. Timelines were outlined, then revised, then narrowed again. For King Charles III, these briefings were received not as abstract information, but as a reckoning. He listened intently, asked pointed questions, requested clarification where ambiguity crept in. He did not interrupt. He did not rush. Those present remarked later on his composure, not because it was effortless, but because it was deliberate. Charles understood what was at stake, not only for himself, but for the institution that had shaped his entire life, and for the son who would inherit it. Legal advisors were brought in early, not to prepare announcements, but to assess exposure. Every word spoken by a monarch carries consequence. Every omission invites interpretation. The law does not govern feelings, but it governs disclosure, and the palace has learned repeatedly that missteps linger far longer than crises themselves. The advice was consistent: say less, avoid timelines, do not frame developments as definitive unless they are unavoidable. Some urged delay. A few suggested that silence for now might still serve. Others recommended a softer formulation, language that acknowledged change without confirming its scale. These suggestions were considered and then resisted. What tipped the balance was not panic nor pressure from outside. It was internal coherence. The palace had reached a point where continuing as before would no longer align with reality. Adjustments were already visible to those trained to notice them. Engagements were being reshuffled. Access narrowed. Patterns shifted. Pretending otherwise risked eroding trust, not among the public, but within the institution itself. For Charles, this distinction mattered deeply. He has spent decades preparing for the crown, longer than any monarch in modern history. That preparation taught him patience, deference, and restraint. It did not teach him avoidance. As the days passed, he began to insist on clarity, not publicly, but privately. "What are we not saying?" he asked at one briefing. No one answered immediately, because the question cut too close to the truth. What was not being said was already shaping behavior, and behavior, once altered, becomes its own form of disclosure. For Prince William, these days were marked by an unsettling sense of anticipation. He was kept informed, but not burdened with every detail. That was intentional. Charles was determined, for as long as possible, to preserve the boundary between monarch and father, to allow his son the dignity of not being prematurely thrust into consequence. Still, William noticed the shifts, the shortened calls, the careful phrasing, the way certain conversations ended sooner than expected. He had grown up fluent in these signals. They were the language of preparation, and they unsettled him precisely because he understood them so well. There were moments when advisors urged Charles to speak with William sooner, more explicitly, to begin the process of transition psychologically, if not institutionally. Charles resisted that too, not out of denial but out of care. He wanted the words, when spoken, to be his own, not filtered through intermediaries, not diluted by strategy, not shaped by fear. This insistence complicated matters because the institution prefers predictability. It prefers staggered disclosures, controlled environments, and incremental adjustments. A direct conversation between father and son, unmediated, introduces variables that cannot be managed. But Charles had reached a conclusion that surprised even those closest to him. If the update was going to change William's life, and it would, then it had to be delivered not as a monarch's directive, but as a father's truth. Behind closed doors, drafts were prepared and discarded. One version was deemed too reassuring, another too blunt. A third was rejected for implying finality where none could yet be declared. Each revision circled the same problem: how to acknowledge gravity without defining outcome. Meanwhile, the external world remained largely unaware. There were no leaks, no whispers that gained traction. That silence was not accidental. It was the result of tightened access and a renewed emphasis on loyalty, not enforced through threat but through trust. Those brought into the inner circle understood the stakes. They knew that misjudgment here would not merely damage reputation, it would alter history. As the days narrowed, pressure mounted. The medical briefings grew less theoretical. The legal advice became more pointed. The institution's instinct to delay clashed with the growing need to act. What ultimately forced the decision was timing. There was a narrow window in which the update could be delivered privately before external circumstances made it unavoidable publicly. Miss that window, and the palace would be reacting rather than leading. Charles recognized the moment. Late one evening, after the final briefing of the day, he authorized preparation for a private update. Not an announcement, not a statement, a conversation. The advisors were informed. The protocol was adjusted. Contingencies were put in place. What they could not prepare for was the emotional cost. Because no amount of briefing, no degree of caution, no institutional wisdom can fully insulate a father from the act of telling his son that the ground beneath them has shifted. When the words were finally spoken, they carried with them the weight of every resisted delay, every softened draft, every instinct, paternal and institutional, that had struggled for dominance in the days leading up to that moment. The update, when it came, was not rushed, but it was inevitable, and once spoken, it set in motion a chain of consequences that no amount of preparation could fully contain. A father and a future king. The conversation did not take place in a grand room. There were no portraits looming overhead, no aides hovering near the door, no ceremonial gravity to signal what was about to happen. It unfolded instead in a private setting chosen precisely because it stripped away hierarchy, a space familiar enough to allow honesty, restrained enough to maintain dignity. When King Charles III began to speak, he did so slowly. Not because he lacked words, but because he understood the power of each one. William listened without interruption. His posture remained steady. His expression is unreadable. To an outside observer, it might have appeared that he was absorbing information clinically, as he had been trained to do since childhood. But this was not a briefing. This was a reckoning. Charles framed the update carefully, not as a conclusion, but as a shift. He spoke of developments, of realities that could no longer be deferred, of timelines that had narrowed. He avoided absolutes. He avoided reassurance. He avoided promises he could not keep. What he did not avoid was the truth. There was a pause midway through, brief, almost imperceptible, when the language of the monarch faltered and the language of the father surfaced. It was there that the weight landed. William's response was not immediate. He asked a question instead, practical, precise, unmistakably shaped by a lifetime of preparation. "What does this change?" Charles answered honestly. "It changes how we prepare," he said. "Not when, not how long, but how." The exchange carried echoes neither of them acknowledged aloud. Decades earlier, another father had spoken to another son, not about illness, but about duty, about expectation, about a life already shaped before it could be chosen. History does not repeat itself neatly, but it does rhyme, and both men were acutely aware of that. William had spent much of his adult life trying to ensure that his own children would never experience the dislocation he had known, the sense that personal emotion must be subordinated to public necessity. Now, sitting across from his father, he felt the familiar compression of time, the past pressing into the present, the future arriving too soon. The tears did not come immediately. They arrived after the questions stopped, after the implications settled, after the room, so carefully chosen for its neutrality, could no longer contain the personal gravity of what had been said. Charles did not reach for protocol. He reached for his son. There was no embrace captured for history, no poetic moment to be remembered, just an instinctive acknowledgement that beneath the layers of ceremony and expectation, this was still a relationship shaped by shared loss, shared endurance, and shared understanding of what the crown demands. William's tears were not a rejection of duty. They were a response to proximity, to the realization that the distance he had relied on, between preparation and reality, between future and now, had collapsed. He had always known this moment would come. He had simply hoped it would arrive later. The conversation continued, but its tone had changed. Charles spoke of safeguards, not institutional ones, but personal, of ensuring that the burden of preparation would not eclipse William's role as a father, of protecting the children from premature exposure to consequence. William listened, but his focus had shifted. He was already recalculating, already mapping what this update meant, not just for the monarchy, but for his family, for the rhythms he had built carefully over years, for the boundaries he had fought to maintain. He did not voice these thoughts aloud, but Charles recognized them. He had once been the son in this exchange. He knew the silence that follows such news, the way the mind races ahead, assembling contingencies no one asked for yet. There was one moment, described later only obliquely, when William asked a question that had nothing to do with succession. "How do I explain this?" he asked, "without frightening them?" Charles did not answer immediately, because the question reached beyond kingship. It touched something far more fragile. When he did respond, his voice was quieter. "You explain it as little as possible," he said, "and only when you must." It was advice shaped not by rain, but by regret. The conversation ended without resolution because resolution was not available. What it provided instead was clarity, not about outcomes, but about direction. When William left the room, he changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally something had shifted. The update had stripped away a layer of abstraction that had long protected him. The role he had been preparing for was no longer theoretical. It had acquired emotional immediacy and with it a cost. Charles remained behind for several minutes after. Those who later observed him described a stillness that bordered on exhaustion. He had delivered the update as required, precisely, responsibly, without distortion. But the personal toll lingered. For all his years of preparation, there was nothing in the manuals of monarchy that addressed this moment, the act of advancing a son toward a future defined by loss. History would frame this exchange in institutional terms. But inside the family, it would be remembered differently. As the day went on, the language of preparation gave way to the language of inevitability. As the moment when a future king stopped imagining his role in abstract terms and began to feel its weight, not as destiny but as proximity. History had not repeated itself exactly, but it had come close enough to leave both men acutely aware of its shadow. And once that shadow falls, the institution closes ranks. When destabilizing information enters the monarchy, it does not spread outward, it sinks inward. The institution has survived for centuries not by reacting loudly, but by absorbing shock through layers of structure, protocol, and silence. What appears from the outside to be inertia is in fact compression. Pressure redistributed carefully so that nothing fractures where the public can see it. This is how the palace protects itself. And this time was no different. Within hours of the private update delivered by King Charles III, the internal atmosphere at Buckingham Palace changed perceptibly. Not in panic, not in urgency, but in density. Conversations shortened, access narrowed. Decisions that once required consultation were executed quietly with minimal discussion. The institution understood immediately what kind of information this was. Not scandal, not crisis, but destabilization of trajectory. Those are the moments the monarchy treats with the greatest caution. Senior courtiers convened in smaller than usual groupings, no broad briefings, no circulation of speculative papers. Only essential personnel were included, each chosen not for creativity or boldness, but for reliability. The question was not how to explain what had happened. The question was how to contain its consequences. The first priority was protection of the sovereign. This did not mean shielding King Charles from scrutiny. That was inevitable. It meant protecting his authority from erosion. Any perception of uncertainty, contradiction, or internal disagreement would invite narratives the palace could not control. Language was standardized immediately. Terms that implied urgency were removed. Phrases that suggested deterioration were flagged and avoided. What remained was neutral, procedural, carefully calibrated to convey continuity. The second priority was protection of the heir. For Prince William, this meant insulation. Not emotional, that was impossible, but structural. His schedule was reviewed with an eye toward invisibility. Appearances that could be postponed without explanation were postponed. Those that could not be altered were reassessed for risk. Risk, in this context, did not mean danger, it meant exposure. The palace has learned that exposure, once allowed, becomes expectation. And expectation is corrosive when a future king is already processing destabilizing truths. To that end, certain sacrifices were made. Projects William had championed were quietly deprioritized. Strategic planning sessions that would normally include him were reassigned. Not because his input was unwelcome, but because his presence signaled continuity, and continuity now required careful pacing. The institution chose stability over visibility. That choice carried cost. Within the palace ecosystem, there are always those who believe that transparency strengthens trust, that openness disarms speculation, that withholding information creates vacuum. Those voices were heard and overridden, because this was not a moment for philosophical debate. It was a moment for institutional survival. What was protected most fiercely was coherence. Every department, from communications to logistics to private secretaries' offices, was aligned around a single objective. Nothing must contradict the central reality that the monarchy remained functional, united, and unshaken. That coherence required discipline. It required restraint from staff accustomed to anticipating needs before they were articulated. It required silence from those whose proximity to power might otherwise have tempted them to share insight. And it required sacrifice of something the palace values deeply: control over narrative expansion. There would be no clarifying interviews, no background briefings, no strategic leaks designed to humanize the situation. Humanization in this instance was deemed too porous. Instead, the institution leaned into its oldest instinct: opacity as protection. Not secrecy. Secrecy invites discovery. But opacity, a surface that reflects little and absorbs much. Internally, contingency planning accelerated. Not publicly acknowledged, but quietly examined. Legal frameworks were reviewed. Constitutional implications were revisited. Lines of authority were reaffirmed. This did not mean succession was imminent. It meant preparedness could no longer be theoretical. Preparedness for the monarchy is not pessimism, it is prudence. Some initiatives were halted midstream, not because they were flawed, but because momentum itself can draw attention. Momentum implies forward motion, and forward motion invites scrutiny. In moments like this, stillness is safer. What was sacrificed above all was narrative comfort. The palace understood that the public prefers stories with arcs, struggle, explanation, reassurance, resolution. By refusing to provide that arc, the institution accepted short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term control. This choice frustrated some observers. It unsettled others, but it preserved the boundary. Behind closed doors, there was recognition that this approach would be misinterpreted by some as coldness. That accusation was anticipated and accepted. Coldness, after all, has never destabilized the monarchy. Contradiction has. The institution closed ranks not to deny reality, but to manage it, to ensure that destabilizing information did not metastasize into destabilizing behavior, to prevent personal vulnerability from being mistaken for institutional weakness, and to give the family, particularly the heir, space to absorb what could not be undone. By the end of the week, the machinery had adjusted. The palace looked unchanged from the outside. Flags flew as usual. Ceremonial schedules proceeded. The rhythm of monarchy resumed its familiar cadence. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. The institution had chosen what to protect. And in doing so, it had accepted what must be sacrificed: immediacy, openness, and the illusion that continuity requires explanation. This is how the palace survives moments that threaten to destabilize it, not by speaking, but by holding and holding fast until the shock is fully absorbed. What the public is allowed to know. What the public was allowed to know was never meant to answer questions. It was designed to prevent the wrong ones from taking hold. Inside the palace, there is a clear understanding that information does not exist in a vacuum. Every word released creates a shape, and into that shape, others will attempt to pour meaning. The task, therefore, was not to explain the situation, but to limit the space in which it could be misinterpreted. This distinction governed every decision that followed the update delivered by King Charles III, and it shaped a communication strategy defined not by transparency, but by restraint. The language that emerged was deliberate to the point of austerity. Statements were stripped of emotional qualifiers that might invite projection. There were no timelines offered, no assurances extended, no metaphors employed to soften impact. The palace understood that reassurance, when not grounded in certainty, becomes a liability. It invites comparison, contradiction, and ultimately erosion of trust. By choosing language that acknowledged gravity without elaboration, the institution accepted a cost: discomfort. But it was a cost deemed preferable to speculation spiraling beyond control. This restraint was not universally welcomed. In the absence of detail, commentators attempted to fill the silence with analysis. Some framed the palace's approach as outdated. Others argued that modern audiences demand openness, that clarity builds confidence. These arguments were familiar and largely academic. Inside Buckingham Palace, the calculation was far more pragmatic. Clarity in moments like this does not always calm. Sometimes it accelerates scrutiny. And scrutiny, once focused on personal health and succession, rarely remains proportionate. Controlled disclosures followed, but they were subtle enough that many did not recognize them as such. There were no dramatic revelations, no anonymous briefings that added texture to the narrative. Instead, certain facts were reinforced indirectly through consistency. Schedules changed in ways that suggested adjustment rather than disruption. Appearances were modified without explanation, signaling continuity without inviting inquiry. Trusted institutions echoed the palace's language precisely, not expanding, not interpreting, not embellishing. This uniformity was not accidental. It was the product of quiet coordination and a shared understanding of the stakes. The role of the media in this moment became a test in itself. Major broadcasters, including BBC, adhered closely to the official wording. Reports were factual, measured, and conspicuously free of conjecture. Analysts declined to speculate on outcomes, focusing instead on process and precedent. This restraint stood in contrast to previous crises, where the appetite for immediacy often overwhelmed caution. Here, the absence of detail appeared to impose discipline. Without new information to dissect, even the most seasoned commentators were forced to pause. That pause, however, was uneven. Beyond traditional outlets, the digital ecosystem behaved differently. Social platforms, unbound by editorial standards, became spaces where concern blurred into curiosity. Innocuous past moments were re-examined, patterns were imagined. Silence was interpreted as strategy rather than necessity. The palace anticipated this and accepted it as inevitable. What mattered was that such speculation remained peripheral, unendorsed by credible sources, unsupported by new facts, and ultimately unsustainable without oxygen from official channels. The cost of clarity, paradoxically, lay in its absence. By refusing to clarify beyond what was essential, the palace relinquished control over emotional narrative. It could not direct how people felt, only how much they knew. This meant accepting that some would experience anxiety, frustration, even resentment. But it also meant preserving something more fragile, the boundary between public interest and private reality. Once crossed, that boundary is rarely restored. The monarchy has learned, often painfully, that generosity with information does not guarantee generosity in response. For Prince William, this strategy had personal implications. Each word withheld publicly reduced the pressure placed on him privately. The fewer interpretations circulating, the less he was required to respond through presence, performance, or reassurance. The palace understood that clarity about process was preferable to clarity about prognosis. One stabilizes institutions, the other destabilizes families. Internally, there was acknowledgement that this approach would be criticized as cold. That accusation was anticipated and absorbed. Coldness, in institutional terms, is survivable. Loss of control is not. The monarchy does not operate on emotional consensus. It operates on continuity. And continuity in moments of vulnerability demands fewer words, not more. As days passed, the initial surge of attention receded. The absence of new information made the story difficult to sustain without crossing ethical lines. Editors moved on. Commentators found other subjects. What remained was a residual awareness, a sense that something serious had occurred and that it was not meant to be interrogated further. This outcome was not accidental. It was the result of language chosen carefully, restraint applied consistently, and disclosures controlled to the point of near invisibility. The cost, however, was borne quietly. The palace accepted that some would feel excluded, that the lack of clarity would leave unanswered questions, that trust, for certain observers, might be strained rather than strengthened. But this was a calculated trade. Trust can be rebuilt. Privacy, once surrendered, cannot. In the end, what the public was allowed to know was not a failure of communication. It was its purpose. a recognition that clarity is not synonymous with completeness, and that in matters involving health, family, and succession, completeness can be a form of harm. The words released were sufficient. Everything else was deliberately left unsaid. After the door closed. After the door closed, nothing officially changed. That was the first illusion. From the outside, the monarchy resumed its familiar rhythm. Flags remained raised. Schedules appeared intact. Ceremonial language continued to speak of continuity, duty, and service. The institution performed stability with the ease of long practice. But behind that performance, something fundamental had shifted, not abruptly, not visibly, but irreversibly. A line had been crossed. Inside Buckingham Palace, the days that followed were marked by a subtle reorientation. Decisions once framed as provisional were now treated as consequential. Conversations once hypothetical became practical. The difference lay not in urgency but in tone. There was less speculation about possibilities and more quiet acceptance of limits. The update delivered by King Charles III had altered the internal calculus of the institution. It forced recognition that time once considered abundant, elastic, had narrowed. Not catastrophically, not publicly, but enough to demand adjustment. Preparedness moved from principle to practice. This did not mean succession planning accelerated visibly. There were no dramatic rehearsals, no overt transfers of responsibility. Instead, authority was redistributed subtly. Certain decisions were delegated with more finality. Certain briefings were reframed with an emphasis on sustainability rather than expansion. The monarchy did not brace for an ending. It prepared for endurance under constraint. For Prince William, the consequences were deeply personal. The private update had collapsed the distance he had relied on, the psychological buffer between present responsibility and future inevitability. That buffer had allowed him to inhabit his role as heir with deliberation rather than urgency. Now urgency existed, not as pressure to act, but as pressure to feel. And feeling, for someone raised to compartmentalize, is destabilizing. Those closest to him observed a change not in demeanor but in focus. His attention narrowed. His patience thinned in contexts that felt peripheral. Initiatives that once energized him now felt secondary to a single overriding priority, protecting what remained untouched by institutional gravity. Family life became more guarded, not withdrawn, guarded. The boundary between public and private, once negotiated carefully, hardened. Choices were filtered through a new lens. Does this expose more than it protects? If the answer was uncertain, the answer was no. Emotionally, the fallout was uneven. There were days of clarity when the update felt manageable, a reality to be integrated rather than feared. And there were days when its implications pressed inward, uninvited, reshaping conversations that had nothing to do with monarchy at all. Loss, even anticipated loss, does not behave linearly. For William, the grief was not for something that had happened, but for something that now had a shape, a horizon, a proximity that could no longer be ignored. For Charles, the consequences were different, but no less profound. He had crossed a line every parent in power dreads, the moment when protection gives way to preparation. By delivering the update himself, privately, without institutional mediation, he had accepted responsibility not only for its content, but for its emotional aftermath. That choice could not be undone. In the days that followed, those around him noticed a quiet withdrawal, not from duty that remained unwavering, but from unnecessary exposure. He conserved energy. He shortened engagements. He spoke less in rooms where his presence alone already commanded attention. This was not frailty. It was prioritization. The monarch understood that every public gesture would now be interpreted through the lens of that update. Strength would be scrutinized. Fatigue would be magnified. Neutrality would be questioned, so he chose consistency. Consistency in tone, consistency in presence, consistency in restraint. That discipline came at a cost, because restraint, when practiced continuously, accumulates. It demands emotional containment that cannot be released publicly. And for a man who had waited a lifetime to speak freely, to shape his reign with intention, the irony was sharp. The institution, meanwhile, absorbed these personal shifts without comment. This is what it does best. It adapts to the emotional realities of those at its center without acknowledging them. It builds scaffolding around vulnerability and calls it continuity. It allows the individual to carry the weight so the structure does not have to. But even institutions have limits. The update had exposed one. By acknowledging change without explanation, the monarchy preserved control, but it also narrowed its margin for error. Future missteps would be measured against this moment. Silence would be interpreted not as tradition but as choice. That distinction matters. Once silence is chosen consciously, it becomes accountable. The long-term consequences of that accountability are still unfolding. Within palace walls, younger aides began to question inherited assumptions. Was opacity always protective? Did restraint always serve the individual as well as the institution? These questions were not voiced publicly, but they lingered. Change in monarchies rarely arrives through declaration. It seeps. For the family, the reshaping was quieter but more enduring. Conversations took on a new gravity. Plans were discussed with contingencies in mind. The future was no longer abstract, it was acknowledged, even if not articulated. The children were not told everything. They were told enough to feel secure, enough to feel loved, enough to remain children rather than symbols. That, perhaps, was the most significant line crossed. In choosing to manage this moment privately first, honestly, directly, without institutional dilution, father and son had altered the pattern. They had allowed the personal to precede the procedural. History would not record this explicitly, but it would feel it, because once such a line is crossed, it becomes a reference point for future crises, for future disclosures, for future heirs sitting across from future kings, facing truths that cannot be postponed forever. The door that closed after the update did more than seal a moment. It marked a transition, not of reign, not of title, but of understanding. The understanding that preparation is no longer theoretical, that distance is no longer guaranteed, that the crown's weight, once held at arm's length, now rests closer than ever before, and that some thresholds, once crossed, do not reopen. They simply redefine what comes next. Some moments reshape history not through ceremony but through silence. If this story helped you understand the hidden pressures behind palace walls, subscribe for deeper royal analysis rooted in truth, restraint, and context. Share this video with someone who values empathy over rumor, and stay with us as this story continues to unfold, not loudly, but consequentially, one careful decision at a time.